There are four classes in Chivalry 2: the Archer, the Vanguard, the Footman, and the Knight. Each class is composed of three subclasses to allow you to further fine-tune your play style. The classes are sorted in terms of most agile and least armored being the Archer, to most armored and least agile being the Knight. As you can see in the top right corner, the stats for each class is listed along with their perks, so if you ever forget, you can check it there. The heart indicates the health, the green indicates the speed, and the lightning bolt indicates stamina. For the most part, each class has access to a primary, a secondary, and an item, with a few exceptions. For example, the Raider has two primary weapons and an item, and the Siege Engineer has several items to use. There are three weapon damage types in the game: cut, chop, and blunt. As you might expect, swords and daggers get the cut trait, axes and halberds get the chop trait, and hammers get the blunt trait. Weapons with the cut damage type have no bonus damage against the heavier armor of the Footman and the Knight. However, they typically are faster than most other weapons and therefore are well balanced in fighting all the different classes in the game. In contrast, weapons with the chop trait are more effective against the heavier armor of the Knight and the Footman, but are typically a little bit more unwieldy to use and slower, thus giving you a trade-off. Both of these weapon damage types can penetrate through multiple opponents with a swing, even without charging up to a heavy attack, which is useful for fighting multiple opponents. First glance, the blunt weapon type might seem the weakest of the three. While it does the most damage to the Knight and the Footman classes, the inability to penetrate through multiple targets and interrupt them when you're fighting multiple opponents can prove to be very challenging. However, this is offset by their extreme single target potential. These weapons are often able to two or one-shot all classes in the game from full health. Each class in the game will have access to all three weapon damage types, so what you use will be up to your personal preference. Additionally, each weapon has three stats that define how it plays, first being the reach, second being the speed, and the third being the damage. The game that will do its best to try to give you details on how the weapon handles before you use it, but my advice is to try them all out to see what you like. What may look great to you on paper might actually end up not playing very well, and vice versa. The first class in the game is the most polarizing one, and my favorite to play, the Archer. The Archer is comprised of the Longbowman, Crossbowman, and Skirmisher subclasses. As you might expect, the Longbowman has access to a bow, the Crossbowman has access to a crossbow, and the Skirmisher has access to a shield and either throwing javelins or throwing axes. The bow is the Archer's most well-rounded weapon. It allows him to fire on the move, meaning he can harass targets from a distance while keeping himself positioned in safety. The bow typically does 40 to 60 damage on a full draw, which is about average for most weapons in the game. But it is variable, meaning that if you release too soon, your accuracy and damage will be impaired. Whereas if you hold back the bow for too long, your stamina will start to drain and your accuracy will also be impaired. So keep that in mind. The Archer's item is a spike trap, which you can use to place and choke points to make it harder for enemies to get to you. And their special is a brazier. The brazier is a placeable fire source that allows you to set your arrows and bolts on fire. Enemy and friendly archers can use this, so keep this in mind. The arrow that is set on fire will set an enemy on fire when it hits, as well as allies alike. The fire does normal damage like you would see from an oil pot, so you're not going to be one-shotting any targets, but it is useful for ensuring you get the kill on a wounded target. Now, note that if you hit a teammate with the fire arrow, they will take full fire damage, and so if they are wounded, you will kill them. It makes it a lot more important to not hit your teammates. The Longbowman has access to the knife, the hatchet, the short sword, and the cudgel as their secondary weapons. In general, these weapons trade damage and reach for speed, meaning that it's important for you to overwhelm your opponents with attacks, lest you get forced to be on the defensive where your low stamina will be punished. Both the knife and the cudgel allow you to overwhelm your foes with intense barrages of fast attacks, useful if you play really aggressively. If you prefer to play a little bit more defensively and have a bit more range or damage, the short sword or the hatchet might be for you. Next up is my favorite, the crossbow. The crossbow does a lot more damage than the bow, but is offset by the fact that you must stay in place when you're reloading it. This makes you a lot more exposed to counter archers and all the melee classes you've pissed off with your constant harassing fire. Your deployable item is the Pavosh shield, which will be useful for providing cover for you during your reloading against enemy archers, although it will do nothing against the melee classes that will inevitably charge you down. Once you charge your special item, you can place a banner. The banner is an AoE healing flag that allows for your team to regenerate health when they are standing within the healing radius. This item was heavily nerfed over the course of the beta. It used to have a very massive AoE range. Now it's rather limited, meaning that placement is much more important. As far as secondary weapons go, the crossbowman has access to the same set of secondaries as the longbowman does, with the exception of the axe instead of the hatchet. The axe is better than the hatchet in every conceivable category, so this is not a loss. One last thing to note about the crossbowman is that, strangely, he has a slight ADS time, where he has an accuracy penalty until the crossbow is fully pulled up. But once you have it out, you can actually run full speed to get into the fray. Last but not least is the Skirmisher subclass, who has access to javelins and later throwing axes as their primary weapon. It comes default with a shield to help you in your melee combat, although the low stamina this class has will not allow you to 1v1 for extended periods of time against the heavier melee classes. The javelins are a decently well-rounded weapon. They have good range and decent damage, although they are kind of slow not only in melee combat but also when throwing, so you have to be methodical about when you use them. They are best used as a support role to help your teammates finish off distracted opponents with the ability to handle yourself if you get ambushed. Meanwhile, throwing axes are faster and generally easier to use. They do slightly less damage and they're not as used in melee combat, but I generally prefer them just because you have more of them and you can harass enemies at range more effectively. Your item is a bear trap, which you can throw down. Enemies that run over the bear trap will take 50 damage and get knocked down, which allows you to punish them if you're close enough. And your quiver that you, as your chargeable consumer item, allows you to fully restock your ammo without having to go to a supply box. Your secondaries are similar to the other archer classes, but generally better. You have the knife again if you want to land dash a very high speed assault on your foes. But if you want to have more damage, you can opt for the falchion, which is not the fastest sword, but it does quite a bit of damage and has good range. Meanwhile, they also have access to the mace, which is one of my favorite weapons in the game. It is high damage and high speed and allows you to really bring the damage down on the knights and the footmans, but it is a blunt weapon, so keep that in mind. The axe is a well-rounded weapon, being able to hold its own against almost any foe in the game. The Vanguard has the highest speed and stamina of any class in the game, allowing them to fight with more vigor than the other classes. You can think of this class as the barbarian of Chivalry 2, and names like Devastator, Raider, and Ambusher reinforce this theme. The first Vanguard subclass is the Devastator. As you might expect, he is all about bringing the pain with the biggest weapons in the game. His first weapon is the Battle Axe, a very well-rounded weapon and one of my favorites. The Battle Axe does great damage against our targets, is pretty quick for how big it is, and has decent range. The War Club is a blunt weapon and therefore struggles in fighting in multiple opponents without the proper cadence. You might think this makes it a poor fit for the Devastator, who loves to be in the thick of the fray, but with proper timing, it is effectively a very long cudgel and allows you to really bring the beat down on foes. The Executioner's Axe is one of my least favorite weapons in this game. It has more reach than the Battle Axe and seemingly has less damage as well, and I don't really find that the actual added reach gives anything for it, but if you find yourself lacking reach with the other weapons, this could be a good fit for you. Next up is the Greatsword. It is a cut damage, which means it struggles a little bit more against the Footman and the Knight classes, which you'll be fighting a lot of. However, it is quite fast and capable of holding its own against any weapon in the game. And they're also access to the Zweihander skin, which is probably one of the best looking skins in the game. Lastly is the Maul. The Maul is extremely slow and has a relatively short reach compared to its brethren. However, it is the only handheld weapon capable of one-shotting every class in the game. You press V for your special attack, and once you hit anywhere on a knight's body, he will go down to the ground. Again, because it's a blunt weapon, it takes some practice in order to find the proper rhythm for it, but it excels at taking out single targets. The Devastator has access to throwing mallets as a throwing consumable. There's 2 of these, and they do pretty decent damage and are great for finishing off kills. The chargeable item is an oil pot, which you throw down, and it puts a pool of fire down on enemies. It's best used to finish off enemies, as the damage is not enough to kill anybody from full health, and the point value is not a whole lot. I generally try to put it somewhere where you get a lot of hits to soften everybody up, or use it against a target or two that I want making sure that gets finished off. Typically, your teammates will run into the fire, not paying attention, which gives you team damage. So just be aware where you throw it. The second Vanguard subclass, the Raider, is not content with carrying only one badass primary into battle, but instead opts for two, so that he can throw one of them without being penalized. This allows you to take down fleeing enemies with a proper throw, or mix up your combat style by incorporating a weapon throw in the midst of a fight. The weapons available to the Raider include the Dane Axe, the Messer, the two-handed hammer, and the glaive. You can equip two of the same weapon if you prefer, or mix and match to suit multiple different enemy types. The first weapon available to you is the Dane Axe. It is a well-rounded weapon with a little bit more reach than the double axe, but less damage to compensate. The next weapon that the Vanguard Raider has is the Messer. This is a very popular weapon, and not only its looks, but it's also its functionality. It is a well-rounded weapon, being fast, having good reach, and doing high damage, making it easy to use against all opponent types and very fun to play. Next is the two-handed hammer. This is kind of a budget weapon of the pole hammer, being not quite as effective in any regard as the pole hammer, but it still does quite well against single targets and can be used to some good effect in multiple team fights. Lastly is the glaive, as I like to refer to it, the war scythe. Its damage is somewhat lackluster compared to the other weapons of its type, but it throws very well in a very predictable arc, and it has a very long range and high speed, meaning you can constantly harass and interrupt opponents with it. The tertiary item for the Raider is actually his secondary, a knife, and lastly, he carries a trumpet into battle as his chargeable item. The trumpet is a very powerful healing weapon with a very large AoE. When activated, it rapidly restores your health and as well as any ally nearby. The last of the Vanguard subclasses is the Ambusher. Unlike his brethren that carry two-handed weapons into battle, the Ambusher instead prefers to carry two sets of secondary weapons into battle, which allows him to carry a set of throwing knives in his left hand. You get 7 throwing knives. They're not especially damaging, but they are great for harassing enemies or otherwise taking down wounded enemies that are distracted. The class has bonus backstab damage, meaning that if you can get behind enemies, you can do more damage and be more effective when they're occupied by your team. But generally, they're going to see you and they're going to try to fight you one-on-one, which is where the class weakness comes into play. He doesn't especially good at brawling against the big, heavier types, so you have to play smart, mixing up your primary and your secondary throwing weapons in order to get the most bang for your buck. In keeping with his ranged melee hybrid theme, he has a quiver that allows him to fully restock his throwing knives without having to find an ammo box. His primary weapons are the same as his secondary weapons, and they're all actually secondary weapons. You can mix and match as you so desire. The first one is a dagger, which is again very similar to the knife that the archer has, but more effective at stabbing. The next one is a short sword, which allows a little bit better head-on brawling capabilities if you find yourself in that situation a lot. The hatchet is again a well-rounded weapon, a little bit more in your face than say the short sword, but has a bit more slow methodical strikes than the dagger. And lastly is the cudgel, which again is one of my favorite weapons in the game just for how quickly and hard it hits. The first Footman subclass, the Poleman, does. The first one of these is the halberd, which has a well-rounded weapon that has quite a good range, but not quite as much as you'd expect. It is well balanced against all factions, having good range, good speed, and good damage. The next poleman polearm is the polehammer, and is an excellent weapon, one that I really quite like. It is a blunt weapon, which means it struggles in fighting multiple opponents, but it does ridiculously high damage and has really good long range, meaning that if you properly space yourself, you can pick targets to your heart's content. Next up is the spear. In previous game, it was really good for a long time because it had broken animations, so you could never really block it properly. And then they actually fixed the animations, and it became pretty terrible because it was just the same animation over and over again. Thankfully, in this game, with the ability to charge heavy attacks and the fact that the swings, you can swing from multiple different angles now, the spear is actually quite powerful. It's not overpressingly so, and if somebody gets in close to you, obviously you're going to have trouble. But if you position yourself far back, you can really take out opponents without really they can be able to do anything to you. Well, another important thing to note about the spear is it has a very unique special attack. Unlike all the other weapons that have basically a very strong heavy attack, when you press V with the spear, you'll duck down and basically go in a defensive position. This defensive position initially seems kind of crappy because you can't really move very well and you can't really attack from it. But it automatically blocks and damages enemies that run up to you. So if somebody runs up to you and doesn't attack, then they will stab themselves on the spear, and then you'll immediately get up to where you can riposte. If they do decide to attack, then you will automatically parry them, and you'll be able to get up and start engaging them. Last off is the glaive, which we've kind of talked about with the raider. It's got good reach and good speed, great for harassing enemies and keeping them at bay. The Pullman's secondary weapons and the item match that of the longbowman, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about them here. He does have his own unique consumable item, which is the bandage kit. You can actually stack multiple of these if you charge it enough. So I think you can carry up to 2 or 3. I can't remember exactly, but it's pretty much what you'd expect. You throw the bandage kit at your friendlies, and they can heal. If you hit them directly with it, it will heal them automatically. If not, it will fall on the ground to where they can pick them up. You can't pick up your own bandage kits and use them, unfortunately. The second Footman subclass is the original Man-at-Arms class from the previous game. Since all the classes have his signature dash ability now, he has a shortened dash cooldown, and he continues to carry his one-handed weapons and shield into battle. If you're getting harassed by enemy archers, this is a great class to choose since you have a shield to protect you. His weapons include the sword, the Morning Star, the falcon, and the one-handed spear. The sword is, as you'd expect, just a all-well-rounded one-handed weapon. The Morning Star is perhaps one of my favorite weapons, if not my favorite melee weapon in the game, being the big brother to the cudgel. It trades some of the cudgel's speed for a higher reach, allowing it more flexibility in the battlefield. This weapon is still fast enough to interrupt most other weapons in the game, and it hits hard enough to hold its own against even the biggest two-handed weapons. Next up is the falcon. You can kind of think of this as the machete. It's a slower, fatter sword with decent reach but high damage. It is still a cutting weapon, so you'll struggle against the knight and the footman, and it is a little bit slower than other weapons of its type, but it is still quite effective and great for cutting down vanguards and archers. Lastly is a one-handed spear, a weapon that originally was been pretty weak but was actually buffed in the later weeks of the beta. As you'd expect, this has a great reach and pretty good damage the trade-off. It's not quite the fastest weapon that the Man-at-Arms has to offer. The Man-at-Arms' secondary weapons are slightly worse versions of his primary weapons, allowing him to continue on without much penalty in the case that he gets disarmed. He has access to the knife, the axe, the short sword, and the mace, which is kind of a mix of what the archers have available to them. All solid weapons in their own regard. The knife is again good for getting up in their face with a barrage of assaults. The axe, a more well-rounded weapon. The short sword being a bit faster than the axe, trading off some damage. And the mace being a great aggressive weapon, just like the Morning Star, having a little bit more speed and a little bit more damage than the Morning Star actually, but just slightly less special damage. The last footman class, the field engineer, might seem like he's at a disadvantage with primaries such as the sledgehammer, the shovel, and the pickaxe. And if looking at the sledgehammer specifically, yes, the weapon is actually, in my opinion, one of the worst in the game. I'm not actually even sure that it's working properly. It seems like it doesn't have the reach that it's supposed to, and the damage is certainly paltry for the type of weapon it is. However, the shovel actually was nerfed because it was so good, and it still remains one of the better weapons in the game. It's quite a fun one to use. It's quite fast. It does solid damage and has decent range too. Lastly is the pickaxe, which has supposedly basically similar damage properties, except it's a chop instead of a blunt, which allows it to go through multiple opponents. It does seem to have less range than the shovel and overall slightly less damage based on my playing. Again, these tooltips are not necessarily 100% accurate. His secondaries include the spike trap and the bear trap. I typically prefer the bear trap, although this one has its uses as well. And he has 2 deployable barricades, which are useful for deploying shields for your team as they're making assault or funneling foes. Last but certainly not least is the Knight, which is comprised of the Officer, Guardian, and Crusader subclasses. The Officer is a well-rounded, heavily armored foe that carries the longsword, the war axe, the heavy mace, or the poleaxe into battle. His secondaries include the sword, the axe, and the mace. He has the trumpet to keep his allies in the fray and can tackle opponents from a sprint. The longsword is a smaller version of the greatsword, having slightly less reach and damage, but being quite effective against all enemies and has good stabs. The war axe trades off the stabbing power for more damage in its swings and overheads, making it a great weapon. It's a slightly more powerful version of the double axe in my experience, and so I quite like it. The heavy mace is a big, slow, blunt weapon, which struggles again fighting multiple opponents because of the blunt damage, but it is quite effective at dealing heavy damage to any foe that it comes in contact with. The last officer weapon is the poleaxe, which has good reach and okay speed, but is surprisingly low damage considering the type of weapon it is. However, if you like to outrange your foes and be really targeted in your strikes, it is a good choice and has quite a bit of range with its stab. It also does bonus damage to shields, which is good for cutting down other crusaders or men-at-arms. The secondary weapons are pretty much just backup weapons and consist of the axe, the mace, and the sword that you're already familiar with. The second knight class is the Guardian, a wall of iron and steel. This behemoth excels at holding the line. In fact, this is my go-to class whenever I need to turn a game around, as the Warhammer is one of my favorite weapons, being basically a even more powerful version of the Morningstar. The Guardian's tower shield has quite a good coverage and makes him almost immune to archers when it's pulled up. And mix this in with his strong one-handed weapons, he can really hold the line and bully any other enemy that makes the mistake of charging him down. The Warhammer is fast, has decent reach, and hits like a freight train, making it very effective if you can properly get in and out of your engagements and interrupt opponents with its strong blows. It is, again, a blunt weapon, so you will not do well fighting multiple foes due to its short range and single point attacks. But I find that this is not really an issue because it hits so strong that you can quickly pick your targets and knock them out and bring the fight down from multiple targets versus you to only one target versus you. The axe is, again, well-rounded. If you like it, you like it. It's not my favorite weapon, but it is certainly not a bad weapon by any means. The Falcon adds a little bit more damage against the lighter classes in regards to less damage against the Knight and the Footman. The one-handed spear has been buffed to bring it in line with the other weapons, allowing its good speed and reach to actually have a place in the battlefield. If you prefer to harass your targets at range and interrupt their attacks, the one-handed spear is a good choice for you. In keeping with his defensive theme, the Guardian gets the banner deployable item, which is great for situations where you need to defend your royalty. Again, it was nerfed over the course of the beta to the point where it is one of the weaker items now, but when placed appropriately, it is still quite good at healing your team, and especially the VIPs. Crusader Knight is a powerful foe, merging the Knight's high health and tackle ability with the Vanguard Devastator's loadout. You'll notice that he shares the battle axe, the two-handed hammer, the executioner's axe, and the oil pot in common with the Vanguard Devastator. Although he gets throwing axes, which are high damage dealing projectiles, allowing you to quickly finish off foes that are retreating or otherwise occupied. He does carry the Messer instead of the Dane axe of the Devastator, but this is overall a beneficial trade as the Messer is quite a potent weapon. I hope this short video on the classes, subclasses, and weapons of Chivalry 2 was useful to you. In the end, it's hard to go wrong with any of the options. Torn Banner has spent a lot of time fine-tuning everything to make sure that they're all balanced and fun to play. If you found this video useful, be sure to let me know down in the comments. And until next time.
God's sakes! Please tell me how to do it. Now let's get back. Stop those foes from firing!